Okay,
to know.
let's do it over. Yeah.
But we might just want to wait a second for that truck. Don't you think?
Is that herbivore too?
That's probably delivering. All right. So, tell me your name again. And
Mine-
what you do.
My name is, let me start that over. My name is Dan Thornton, and I'm a filmmaker and digital video and audio artist.
Nice to meet you, Dan.
Nice to meet you, Cindy Apple.
So originally, you started doing a documentary about Keith Singh. And I'm just curious about what drew you to Keith. Like, what was it? You met him through David.
I can tell that whole story.
That'd be great.
So I met Keith Salmon through David Feeney. David Feeney is a researcher at University of Edinburgh in the Moray House of Education. And David does work in visual impairment and aesthetics and art. And so I met Keith through David. And Keith and David had been working together through David's research projects, and immediately we met at I met Keith at an opening of his work in Edinburgh at the Gallery of the Corner, a retrospective of Keith's work, and I was there with David, and Keith and I really hit it off. He's a really engaging person and also a really compelling artist, and I was drawn to Keith as just as a human being, as a person. He's a really just great guy to hang out with and to talk about creativity with. Plus, he's also kind of an amazing artist. And so I was drawn to Keith because basically he's a very accessible artist. He's someone who's very open about his process, about what it's like to be a painter, what it's like to be a creator of works, and then also as a working artist. And so I really engaged with Keith on that level.
Did you think you would do a film about him at that first meeting?
Not necessarily. When I first met Keith, I wasn't necessarily thinking about him as a subject as a film. At that point, I was working with David Feeney and supporting him in his research efforts, pairing visually impaired people with visual art in museum settings, and Keith was just a subject of David's ongoing research into visual impairment and aesthetics. I met him at that point, and then Keith offered to take us to a place on Arran Island off the west coast of Scotland in the Firth of Clyde, and take us. Let me restate that a little bit clearer. I'm gonna have to wait for that. Okay. When David and I met Keith at the Gallery in the Corner for his show, after talking for quite a while about Keith's work and how also it was fitting into David's research and my research at the time in visual impairment and aesthetics, Keith just offered to take us up into the hills on Arran Island in the Firth of Clyde, not far actually from Keith's studio, to a place called Glen Rosa, and that we would all walk together. And Keith suggested that I bring my camera with me to shoot both stills and video within Glen Rosa, because it was beautiful and it was a place that Keith had been returning to over and over again in his work, walking and painting the Scottish Highlands. And so Keith just offered, said, why don't you come out and just do a hike with me and my partner Anita? And we said sure, and so we scheduled that, and David and I went over to Irvine to meet Keith, to see his studio, to meet Anita, and then we all very early one morning went to took the ferry from Ardrossan to Brodick on Arran, and then from there walked actually into Glen Rosa. And I brought camera gear with me and also audio gear with me. And at that point, David was already thinking about doing a short film about Keith and his work. And so we took that opportunity to actually start thinking about working on a film together. And I actually shot some interviews with David and Keith on Arran in Glen Rosa and that ended up being a short film that David and I presented at a conference in Estonia. Gosh, maybe just 2 or 3 months after that initial hike. Yeah.
So, you're obviously not Scottish.
I am obviously not Scottish. Yes.
But,
How could you tell?
what had brought you to Scotland?
So I spent a year at the University of Edinburgh as a postgraduate student on a fellowship doing research in visual impairment and cinema. So I'm a filmmaker by training. I wanted the opportunity actually to extend that knowledge within an academic framework. And so I was a Keasbey Memorial Foundation Scholar at the University of Edinburgh. And that's where I met David Feeney and started doing work with him there. So I was actually in Scotland for a year doing work around aesthetics, filmmaking, and visual impairment.
So going out on this hike, is hiking something that you as well, so to be out in the landscape, I know you've done pictures as well.
Mm-hmm.
Did you feel a particular connection as well to Keith does, right? Because that's what he paints.
Right. I was initially attracted to Scotland and the University of Edinburgh because they had an innovative postgraduate program called Film in the Public Space, and that was my initial desire to actually study in Edinburgh. And so to get the fellowship just made it easier. Part of my photography practice is that I love shooting landscapes. And at that point, in the year that I was in Scotland, I hadn't actually seen that much of the Highlands or sort of the iconographic. Sorry, let me reverse. At that point in my time at Edinburgh, I actually hadn't seen that much of the iconic sort of Scottish landscapes, the sort of the Highlands and even the Lowlands and the coastal areas. And so the opportunity to go to Arran was great because it's an island that is often referred to as Scotland in miniature, meaning that it's a relatively large Inner Hebridean island that has both highlands and lowlands in it, and it's easily accessible by ferry. So to have that opportunity also to have Keith guide David and I through that landscape and to be able to see it through his eyes, so to speak, was a real opportunity to really be embedded in a place in Scotland that was really quite beautiful, quite remote in its own way to actually get to Glen Rosa. But once you're in the Glen, it's absolutely stunning scenery, and I hadn't really seen anything like that. I mean, I base myself on the American West Coast, and I certainly have no lack of, beautiful landscapes to participate in and to shoot. And I spend a fair amount of time actually traveling around the northwest of the United States, looking at those landscapes and photographing them and, shooting video of those landscapes. But this was really my first opportunity to really embed myself into the Scottish landscape, and it was stunning, absolutely stunning. I took a lot of photographs on that initial hike into Glen Rosa, and I shot a lot of video as well. And we were lucky enough to have sort of an interesting day where we had almost all 4 seasons in one day. We had rain, we had snow, we actually bright blue skies at various points, and we were able to actually experience that beautiful glen and all the sort of opportunities that the Scottish weather offers people when they're out in the wildness of Scotland.
Sounds very Scottish.
It was very Scottish. It was very beautiful.
Or was that something that he brought up to you?
So there's two things that came up on that initial Glen Rosa hike. One of which is that Keith was thinking about expanding his work to do a much larger piece than he normally would do, and then also to do it in a really public way. So he has a tradition of open studios, so that if you go visit Keith's studio in Irvine, the doors, if he's there and he's working, the doors are always open. People can come in and out. It's very open experience for people who want to engage with Keith. He wanted to extend that sort of open doors opportunity and to do a very large piece in public. And at that point, we were initially talking about this idea of doing maybe even like a webcam and a live broadcast within Keith's studio. But Keith's really entrepreneurial, to use a word, and having a relationship with the Harbor Art Center in Irvine, which is very close to his studio. Keith was in discussions with them about potentially doing a large piece, in a public arena where people could, come and watch him work, as well as maybe incorporate, some sort of webcam experience into that. The Harbor Art Center, and Keith came up with this great idea that Keith would do a large-scale piece within the center itself. And Keith had chosen Glen Rosa, and the head of Glen Rosa, which has this amazing panorama of these highland mountains at the head of the glen, and to use that as a piece where he could do a very large-scale graphite drawing of that. And so those discussions actually were begun to some degree on that initial hike with me, Keith, Anita, and David. And Keith and I really started talking about that as we were making our way actually into the Glen. And he was talking about photography with me. We were talking about webcams and digital enabled opportunities for artists working, in public. And, Keith had already loosely been talking about that. And even on that first initial hike that we did together, that began to gel a little bit even further into this idea of doing this large piece. And then ultimately he did do a large piece in the Harbor Arts Center based on the top of Glen Rosa and that vista. It was through actually Keith worked with, through Keith's association with the Harbor Arts Center, he came to know Graham Byron, and Graham was working for the council at the Harbor Arts Center to provide audio and video support for their programming there. And when Keith started planning to do this large-scale Glen Rosa drawing at the Harbor Arts Center, he started talking to Graham more and more about support for that, and knowing that Graham's history is in sound production, sound reinforcement, and digital audio recording. They struck up a natural, I think, conversation about Keith's thinking beyond just the purely visual and thinking about incorporating audio into his work.
Did they set up the webcam?
Yes.
Did you set it up, or who set up the webcam?
Graham Byron set up the webcam, and it wasn't a live webcam because the nature of it being a council building meant that to have broadcasts to over the internet of people just coming into the space created some privacy issues. So what Graham would do is that he collected a time lapse of Keith working in that space every day, and then that would be put up on the web, and that became the sort of public experience outside of the Harbor Arts Center. But Keith certainly had worked at the Harbor Arts Center on this large drawing through open hours, and was able to engage with the public as they came in and watched him work.
What happened after the drawing was done, the hack drawing? I don't remember what actually happened.
Yeah, so let's go back just a little bit to that initial Glen Rosa hike with David, Anita, and I. and Keith. During that initial hike in Glen Rosa, Keith revealed to me that his eyesight was not just deteriorating because of his initial diagnosis of diabetic retinopathy, but that Keith had developed cataracts as well. And so it was just not that long before we went up into Glen Rosa that Keith recognized that his sight would, what little sight he did have, would be declining even further. And this was getting him to think about how he was going to start creating beyond the purely visual. So that was also the backdrop to that first initial Glen Rosa hike, was that Keith was grappling with this notion that the cataracts were ultimately going to deprive him from what little sight he had even at that time. So he already was starting to loosely think about other ways of working, and audio was a part of that. After the Glen Rosa drawing, Keith and Graham started thinking about working together in more formal ways, where Keith would actually go out into the Scottish landscape with an audio recorder and sort of teach himself how to capture audio. Graham gave him a basic tutorial on how to use a handheld field recorder that he could use on his own with some help from Anita. But mostly Keith mastered how to use that field audio recorder, and he went out and just made some initial recordings on his hill walks around Scotland. And although primitive at first, Keith really did get the hang of actually how to use the recorder, and by extension to that, started listening to the landscapes in ways that he hadn't before. So he was moving from a purely sort of visual experience to one that was audio. And so he was growing his own practice. Meanwhile, I was back in the United States working, and I had the opportunity to start consulting and working with Microsoft Research in Redmond, Washington, just outside of Seattle. And through my work with primarily one of their lead researchers, Neil Joshi, I heard about other work that was being done at Microsoft Research, and one of which was this Eyes-Free Art initiative that they were developing as an interpretive device using proximity to paintings within a gallery setting, how you could deliver an audio signal to someone who was visually impaired. So just concurrently, while Keith was exploring audio, I had the opportunity to start working with Microsoft Research as they were developing this new technology at Microsoft.
So with Neil, like I remember coming up and meeting you guys up at the bar.
Yeah.
Which,
Was that our first meeting?
well, that's what I was trying to remember. So last time I was doing my notes. And
Yeah.
you showed that software, but I felt like it was the first time you guys had met. But
I think it might have been.
What had actually happened?
What had happened.
Yeah.
So Neil and I had met through John Boylan. Wait for that.
Yeah, sorry.
Yeah, no worries.
Yeah. Okay, tell me again, but-
Yeah. So Neil and I met up one night in Seattle at my local bar to talk about actually work that Microsoft Research. Scratch that. Pick up. Neil Joshi and I met one night at my local bar to talk about work that he was doing at Microsoft Research, particularly around film and video capture. I had been introduced to Neil before and knew a little bit about the work that he was doing, but he was interested in me as a filmmaker, and I was certainly interested in what Microsoft Research was doing, at the cutting edge of video capture technology. Neil had done a lot of really interesting work at Microsoft, using multiple camera systems, using all sorts of different sort of technologies that Microsoft Research was doing that I can't necessarily really talk about because it's proprietary. But Neil wanted to talk to a filmmaker about work that they were doing and sort of compare notes. So Neil brought his laptop with him, and we were actually sitting at the bar, and Neil opened his laptop and was going to show me the initial prototype PowerPoint demonstration about Eyes-Free Art. But he had another slide deck up and very quickly I noticed very, very quickly before he was able to sort of shut it down and load up the new PowerPoint that just the Eyes Free Art title of the slide deck presentation. And I was like, wait, what's that? Neil didn't know anything about my history at that point. He knew I'd been in the UK for a while, but he didn't know anything about my research work that I had done around visual impairment in cinema. So I saw that and I was like, wait, just walk me through that. And so Neil actually walked me through the Eyes Free Art prototype just by happenstance. And
So what was he going to show you on the laptop?
he was going to show me work that they were doing. They were in the process doing app development for iOS and Android about what ultimately became the Pixel app. Doesn't really matter. Yeah, Pixel app. So that image stabilization for video cameras. He was going to show me work that they were doing in video in image stabilization in video, particularly in mobile.
So this Eyes for Art wasn't at all what you guys were really going to be talking about?
We were not going to be talking about this prototype, this Microsoft prototype, Eyes Free Art at all. It just so happened that the slide deck was up. I saw it briefly and I was like, what's that? And Neil was like, oh, this is like our Eyes Free Art project that we're working on with one of our interns who's based at the University of Washington, who's working with Microsoft Research this summer. And so it just so happened also that Microsoft Research was presenting a demonstration of the Eyes Free Art prototype at their offices in Redmond in just a matter of weeks after that. And so he gave me an invite to do that. So I went to the demonstration, saw the prototype, and I was one of, I think, about maybe 25 people who were invited to look at this piece. And there were artists, museum curators, people who specialized in ability and access issues. There were other researchers who were involved as well. Most of the discussion was primarily about actually how this would function in a gallery setting. And so the feedback, supportive and critical, was largely just located to how the original prototype was presented, which is that it would be used to interpret an already existing piece of art that was hanging on a wall in a gallery.
So at what point when did the dots get connected for Neil, for Keith? Like,
Well,
how did that?
while I was sitting there and listening to some of the feedback, and I had the opportunity to try out the actual device and to hear from the team of researchers who had designed this prototype, I immediately thought that if you were going to sort of push this technology in a direction, one interesting way of pushing it would be to, instead of it actually being designed to interpret an already existing piece of work that was in a gallery, that why didn't you get an artist to actually author within the prototype? So the original prototype basically had zones of engagement in relationship to your distance to the painting, plus some basic rudimentary hand gestures that could trigger some audio feedback that would tell you something about the painting or play an audio soundtrack, or, you know, pretty straightforward stuff. And I was like, well, why don't we get an artist actually to create a new piece of work, visual piece of work, that also had this audio component to it, and have that artist just work entirely within the prototype and develop a new piece of art. And I remember initially a lot of people were just sort of silent about that. No one, I guess, apparently had really thought about that. And the only reason that I thought about it, well, I mean, one of the reasons is that because I do work in audio and I work in video and I work in visual arts and audio, and I combine them. But another reason I think that it came to me to make that suggestion was because I already knew an artist, a visual artist, who was starting to work in audio, and it just so happened that that artist was also visually impaired. After the meeting, I put it out there to Neil and the rest of the team. I was like, I happen to know an artist. If you want to talk to this artist about get their feedback on what you're doing as a prototype, you know, I could connect you guys. And it wasn't long after that that Neil came back and said, you know, we like this idea of partnering with an artist and to push the technology in ways that we wouldn't necessarily design it to see where it could go. And we really like the opportunity potentially to work with a visually impaired artist to continue this. And so the whole Microsoft research team was very interested in it, and I started putting together the pieces to sort of produce this opportunity.
So how did you take this to Keith, or I mean...
Email.
Huh?
I sent Keith an email. I got a copy of the original slide presentation that I had actually seen on Neil's laptop in the bar. And one thing I need to actually stop here about this. So do you know there's like a... Yeah, so I just want to make sure that you're resetting so that you don't, so it doesn't shut itself off.
Yeah, no, that was 26 minutes.
Yeah, that's right at the border there. Okay, so what was that question again?
How did you get into, or how did you...
Yeah. So I sent Keith an email, and I attached the original PowerPoint. I sent Keith an email, after the meeting and after the Microsoft team expressed interest in working with Keith potentially, I went ahead and sent Keith an email, CC'd the rest of the research team, plus David Feeney, and some other people who were working in aesthetics and visual impairment. I sent an email out to all of them, but designed specifically for Keith. And I attached a description of the project and also the slide presentation.
And that's okay. So, so at this point, you know, you hit a point where, so tell me what Keith's response back was.
Once Keith got the email, it wasn't long before he responded very positively about the opportunity. He wanted to know more. There was some great contribution to that email chain from various people, including David Feeney, and other people who are working in visual impairment and aesthetics. But it's really designed for Keith's input, and Keith was immediately very intrigued by the idea.
So this became the Oregon Project.
Ultimately, this became what was called the Oregon Project, because our first challenge was to get Keith to the United States and to meet with the Microsoft team to get a demonstration of the prototype, the Eyes Free Art prototype, and to potentially do some work around it in proximity to the research team. I was actually able to secure us an opportunity to go to a very unique part of the American West where Keith could actually work in landscapes that were different from Scotland, but also that he could do, he could exercise his creative process in the way that he does it in Scotland, which is basically to go into the landscapes, is collect as much visual information as possible, but now with actually adding audio into that, and to also give him the opportunity to experience landscapes that were completely new to him. So I was able to secure a residency for Keith, Anita, and myself in Joseph, Oregon, which is in a remote northeast corner of the state of Oregon, where you have the confluence of three very specific, iconic American Western landscapes, one of which was native prairie grasslands, another is a very, very deep canyon, and also alpine mountains, the Wallowa Mountains, all sort of converge within easy access to Joseph, Oregon. And Joseph has a vibrant art scene, primarily. Checking 1, 2, checking.
It's still recording at the moment.
Yeah, this is recording too. I'm just going to double check my audio. Checking 1, 2, checking. This is good. Great.
So, so with you had been to Joseph, Oregon before,
Mm-hmm.
right? What took you out there already?
So,
Or how do you have a relationship with that area? Like why
yeah,
you think to take you?
not long before I, trying to think of the timing here. Just a matter of months before I initially saw the Eyes Free Art demonstration in the bar with Neil. I had been on a residency, photographic residency in Joseph, Oregon. This place that I was ultimately able to take Keith and Anita to for them to do work. I had, the year before, had done a residency there around photography, and I judged a photo contest, a landscape photo contest in Oregon, and did some master classes around photography.
So, one thing that I think is kind of interesting is I'm hearing all these different, you had this connection with the Giuseppe Center, you had this connection with landscapes, you were working on a project with David Feeney, you were then, starting to work on this project with Neil. It seems like there's a lot of, you're really open to working with other people. So I guess it seems like you have a trait of collaborations, maybe. Would you say that you creatively, that you tend to go to collaborations? Do you think that is part of your creative process?
Yeah, I mean, that's an interesting question. I haven't really thought about it that way. I think as someone who works in creative communities, as someone who is self-identified as an artist and filmmaker, it's often as important for me to feel a part of that community and support that community as it is to actually do my art, because I think they're intertwined. It's interesting that Keith and I actually spoke about this really early on in our relationship. In fact, I think it was on the ferry back from Glen Rosa, from that initial hike, is really when I got a chance to really sit down and talk to Keith one-on-one about being an artist and being a creative person, the importance of community, the importance of support, and the importance of getting your work out there. So I hadn't really thought about what it was about the Oregon project that allowed for all these different groups to come together over thousands of miles. I mean, I'm certainly part of that process, but I think it stems from that I have a belief that to be an artist and creative person is one thing, but also to recognize that you are part of a community of other creative people and artists, and that it's important for us to be supportive of each other, to be aware of each other's work, and to be open to other people's work. That makes my work better, and I believe it makes our community stronger. And so that's always been a part of my arts practice, is also to, as much as possible, support the communities of artists that I am aware of and that I'm engaged with, whether that's working in the Pacific Northwest of the United States or whether that's working in Scotland, because I work in both places. And it's important for me to be connected to artists in my communities wherever they are. We're liberated to some degree now by having digital access via the internet and the World Wide Web to have instantaneous communications all over the world. And so I even see that the notion of my community is larger than just my geographic community. So that's why having the opportunity to work, 300 miles away in Joseph, Oregon, informs my work in, 6,000 or 7,000 miles away, whether I'm working in the UK or in Europe. These are all extensions of how I think about community. Keith is just as part of my creative community as someone that's, just down the street from me here in Seattle. They're equally important, and I think the Oregon Project is, to a degree, maybe a reflection of how I think about community.
What brought you into the audio process for the Oregon Project? Because I think you're listed as an audio
Yeah, I'm one of the audio artists on this. And Keith was the lead audio artist on the Oregon project. And that was important that Keith really took the lead on the audio part because we were going to be so dependent upon and reliant, let me say that again. It was important that Keith be the lead audio artist as well as the lead video artist for the Oregon project because we were going to be so dependent upon Keith's visual representation of these Oregon landscapes, and we wanted to develop the opportunity for him to really think through that interpretive process through audio, and to have that creative back and forth between what he saw and what he rendered on paper and what he heard. I was a part of that because I understood some aspects of the American landscape and what they offered as audio opportunities as well as visual opportunities in a way that was unique to my experience of the Oregon landscapes and also the Eastern Washington landscapes and Central Washington landscapes that we also traveled through and spent time in as we made our way down to Joseph. So I also have a history, sorry. I also have a history in doing music, audio art, and field audio recordings. And so I'm continually, as both an adjunct to my film process and filmmaking practice, I'm also thinking about audio and recording audio, but also doing audio work that's outside of that. So I was really looking forward to the opportunity to work in partnership with Keith in doing field recordings and sort of thinking through how these would work at that point, work with an unknown visual piece that we were also collecting information for.
Because really at that point, you guys went from a documentarian role to
Yeah.
a collaboration. Really, like, what was that like to have Keith? You'd already worked with Keith in Scotland.
Yeah.
And now he's coming to America, right?
Yeah.
How was that transition for you to go from working with him as filmmaker to actually working with him to work on this new development for him?
That's a really interesting question because I did, yeah. I mean, I was still in the process of making this film about Keith, and then I moved into the role of a collaborator with him as we were doing field recordings and thinking about how the Oregon project ultimately would be presented in a three-dimensional audio space. And that was part of my work, was to actually design the speaker grid and the user experience in the room. Neil was going to handle programming in partnership with me, building out the grid, and then Keith and I were collecting sounds together in the field, and then Keith was working back in Scotland with Graham Byron to actually mix those sounds together. Some of those were Keith, some of those were mine, some of them were just synergistic audio recordings that developed between Keith and Graham. And so it was a weird transition. In some ways, like, I didn't stop making the film, but I stopped focusing solely on that so I could actually be available to the creative process that underscored the Oregon project, or what became the Oregon project. So that was an awkward transition, I think, in some ways. Not because of Keith and I think Keith and I fell into a really great rhythm working together, and we had many great discussions about conceptually how the Oregon project would ultimately exist in the world experimentally, and how that it would exist for people who would be walking into the Oregon project as an artistic and aesthetic experience. We had some great, I think, discussions about that, and some real tension, actually. We didn't always disagree at all as collaborators, but it was fruitful, those discussions nonetheless. But that was a transition. I went from documenting Keith to actually collaborating with Keith, and then at the same time sort of thinking about how I was going to document this process. Because the original idea for the film, the documentary about Keith Salmon, was going to end with the conclusion of the Glen Rosa Harbor Art Center large-scale drawing piece. But it got extended back out because there was this opportunity to work with Microsoft Research.
So, I know because I was there, but, so Oregon, let's talk just a little bit about the road trip. What was it like to be in this different place with Keith? Or actually, let me say it this way. What was your favorite part of that trip?
Favorite part of the trip going from
From
Seattle to Oregon?
To Oregon and being there for that residency and doing the field record, like what, was it?
What was my favorite part of that trip?
Yeah.
I think it was the opportunity to see some of these landscapes through other people's eyes. The genuine excitement that I saw in Keith and Anita being in these landscapes was infectious. It reinvested me to some degree in how I see these landscapes. I don't take these landscapes for granted because I'm not from the American West. I'm from the American East Coast. And so actually these landscapes to some degree are as foreign to me as they would be for anybody who wasn't from the West Coast of the United States, right? These are landscapes that are absolutely profound and beautiful. World-class National Geographic visual places that are really stunning, right? And I've been in them and continually fascinated, but it made it even better to be able to introduce these landscapes to Keith and Anita, as it must feel to Keith and Anita to introduce similar iconic landscapes to me, who's not from Scotland. That was really exciting.
Do you think that trip was easy for them?
No.
Why?
No, I think traveling internationally is hard. Traveling internationally when you're visually impaired is just that much harder, and it's something that I can't even necessarily relate to. You spend a lot of time in an airplane. You're, taken out from one environment that you're familiar with to another one that's, significantly different. We do speak the same language, more or less, but we drive on a different side of the road. The food's different, really different. The sheer size of American landscapes are just, exponentially bigger than they are in the UK. So I think, the sizes of the cities, the sounds of the cities, they're just, they're bigger in many ways. Seattle skyline is much bigger than, the skyline of Irvine or even of Glasgow, right? Or of Edinburgh, they're all big cities and they're all metropolises, but they're different. American, landscapes are different. So I think this is a difficult process. We spent a lot of time in driving, though I think to some degree that was enjoyable to them because they got to see a lot of different landscapes.
It's a road trip.
And it's a road trip, right? American road trips. We have a tradition in America of doing road trips, right? And we did an American road trip, right? So we stopped along the way. We experienced the Columbia River Gorge. We stopped in Hood River, Oregon. We split the trip up. On the way back, we came up a different route through eastern Oregon, up through the Grand Ronde Canyon Valley, which is really iconic, and then up through the Palouse part of eastern Washington, which is really stunningly beautiful, rolling hills, really, in some ways similar to Scotland, but in some ways very different. But we also got a chance to sample a lot of sort of small town America, which I think is also a really interesting aspect of the American West. You have these rural towns that, and some of them haven't changed that much in, generations, and they're absolutely beautiful, and in their own way, they're icons of the American West. So we got a chance to, spend some time in small American Western towns, which is, I think unique in, anywhere in the world. So it was really great to have that experience, but I also think that that amount of travel is hard on anybody, and I, of course, I think it's hard for international travelers as well.
So from Oregon,
Mm-hmm.
and being Oregon, doing this, so then this project starts to happen. I mean, it's really coming together, and it sounds like Graham was already part of it at that point, or had he made the connection yet between the hack? When did he get involved in Oregon?
Yeah, so Graham, once we got a sign off from Keith that this is something that we wanted to explore further, and then there became a commitment from Microsoft's research to actually invest a little bit in this opportunity of having Keith, author within what became the Oregon Project prototype. Graham was brought into that process relatively soon. Graham and Keith already had a relationship working and thinking through these initial forays into Keith working with audio. So they already had a great creative relationship and were working together on field recordings in Scotland, thinking about mixing them, thinking about presenting them in conjunction with Keith's visual work. So they were already sort of, on that journey together as co-creators. And so naturally we brought naturally we brought in Graham almost right away. We got the whole research group together and we did a conference call with Graham and Keith. Keith and Graham were in Scotland. We were all in Redmond at the Microsoft research headquarters. And we started talking about that, and we made ourselves available to answer any questions that Graham had to talk about ultimately what this might look like. At this point, too, it was still, we didn't know necessarily what we were going to do. We didn't know how we were going to deliver the audio necessarily. Were we going to use headphones? Were we going to use speakers? How many detection devices were we going to use? How many Microsoft Connect detection devices we were going to use? How big the room was going to be? How big the art was going to be? We were just now at this early stage getting Graham's input to how this ultimately might be experienced by someone as an art installation, as a visual and audio installation.
So 92.
Yeah.
Where Oregon Project happened.
Mm-hmm.
Or I guess, so it, would you say it debuted? What would you call
Yeah.
how that?
So the Oregon Project, as a realized audio-visual installation, debuted in October of 2016 at the 92 Festival in Seattle. And Neil and I had already known each other through being part of the support group that was conceptualizing the 92 festival. I believe that's how we met. I think, yes, Neil and I first met, that's right. Neil and I first met at a meeting, at a very early meeting for the sort of advisory committee for the 92 festival, which was going to take place in October of 2016 in Seattle, Washington. 92 was conceptualized by John Boylan, who was working at Microsoft Research at the time as an advisor and manager of artists who were partnering up with researchers at Microsoft to develop technologies in purely aesthetic ways. And so that's how Neil and I met. Neil and I met at a 92 planning meeting.
Well, I thought my card was going in, but it's not.
Nope.
So I do
Yep.
want to make sure
Nope yet. Nope
touch
yet.
on a couple things. So I might jump around a little bit.
Please do. Yeah.
So what do you think, so this has really become a big collaboration piece.
Yeah.
The Oregon Project has.
Yeah.
So with that collaboration, were there challenges with the actual implementation of the Oregon Project at 92?
The Oregon Project was not easy. The Oregon Project is not easy. The Oregon Project has a lot of moving parts. It has a visual component, it has an audio component, it has computer programming, it has hardware components that are really delicate and precise in terms of motion tracking. It has a programming environment on the computer that's not easy. That takes a great deal of imaginative thought, but also coding knowledge to be able to code all these elements together so that they work in a way that seems seamless. The Oregon Project provides a lot of challenges for all the artists involved, right? Probably the three biggest collaborators in this, Neil, Keith, and myself, spent a lot of time not just conceptualizing the piece, but also trying to implement it. And it was not easy.
Would you call it successful?
I personally believe that the Oregon Project is successful, and it's successful purely for this reason, is that it asks questions of how this technology can work to further an aesthetic experience for people who are both visually impaired and fully sighted, and everyone in between. But its biggest success, I think, is actually asking more questions of how we can use technology to enhance creative expression by artists and aesthetic experiences by people who are interested in art and who want to see and hear artistic practice and creative practice. So is it successful? Yes, in that sense. Is it successful in the way that we ultimately wanted it to be successful in terms of an aesthetic experience? No, I think all three of us would have points about the Oregon Project where we believe that it fell short of what we wanted it to do, of what we wanted that experience to look like and feel like. I think all three of us have disappointments about how the Oregon Project was.
Now, so the Oregon Project happened in Seattle. Why take it back to Scotland? Like, why did the Tent Gallery happen?
You know, we debuted the Oregon Project at 92, and that was the plan. That was 92. Was a festival of creativity and engineering and science, right? Artists, scientists, and engineers getting together to collaborate. And the Oregon Project was a perfect place to debut this work. And I think it was really successful. I think there's a lot of evidence to think that people had really unique and interesting experiences with the Oregon Project. While we were even conceptualizing it, Neil and I actually flew to Scotland to work with Keith, Graham, and Anita in the development stage as we were moving from the prototype to ultimately what would debut as a three-dimensional audio experience in Seattle in October. So Neil and I flew to Scotland and worked with the team there to to build it up. While I was there in Scotland, I reconnected with one of my contacts at Edinburgh College of Art, a guy by the name of Donald Urquhart, and Donald runs the Art, Space, and Nature program, postgraduate program at ECA in Edinburgh. And I knew that ECA had this kind of fantastic gallery in their Evolution House, and that that Art, Space, and Nature had this gallery called the Tent Gallery in the ground floor of the Evolution House at Edinburgh College of Art. And I knew that that was potentially a place we could take some version of the Oregon Project to essentially bring it home in a way, to bring it back to Scotland, where Keith is from and where Graham is from, and where there's potential interest in developing these kind of initiatives further. And that's where Keith and Graham are based. And so I connected with Donald Urquhart at Art, Space, and Nature, and they run the Tent Gallery at Evolution House in Edinburgh, and just to see if he was interested in at all. And so I met with Donald and Neil and talked about this, and Donald immediately understood that this was interesting work and that it was worth exploring, and offered to actually host a version of the Oregon Project in Edinburgh at the Tent Gallery.
Do you feel like, was it a new piece? Was it a continuation of the old piece?
No, I mean, one of the things that the Oregon Project affords us is its scalability. What we presented in Seattle at 92 was something that we can shift around and move around. And even though the Tent Gallery is a nice big space, it's not as big and as malleable as as what we had available to us at King Street Station for 92. At 92, we built walls, we installed into an open grid, we had a lot of freedom, we had a lot of a space to work in. Tent Gallery is big, but it's not that big, and it provides some very sort of finite limitations in terms of ceiling height, in terms of size of rooms. And so we actually take the Oregon Project and fit it into a space that was very different from 92, which provided a lot of great opportunities to do more research about how we presented the audio grid overhead, what kind of speakers that we used, and this, how we arrayed the speakers, and how we arrayed the Microsoft Connects, and where people would stand in relationship to the art. And then, as well as that, we took the opportunity to develop a smaller piece that was headphone based, where we used some of the engineering work of Ryan Scott, who was one of my students in Seattle, who was an audio student doing programming in audio in three-dimensional space.
So it sounds like there were some challenges.
It was really challenging.
Were there frustrations?
There was a lot of frustrations. I think there were frustrations certainly at 92. I mean, one of the things about 92 is that most people's experience of it was fairly seamless. Whether it was a good or bad experience aesthetically, that's up to the people who participated in it. And we got a lot of good feedback with things that people liked about the Oregon Project at 92 and what people, didn't like about it or thought could be improved. That had its own sort of structural and engineering challenges. Do you need to restart that?
I didn't end yet, but.
Yeah, sure. And then certainly the technology that we built for 92 wasn't going to be easy necessarily to install in a new location. So going back to my original thought about the 92 experience is that we were working right up to the debut. The doors opened at 92, and we needed to go live. We needed to be live, and we had some problems going up to that point. One of which is that we all needed to take a break and change our clothes because we hadn't slept, and we were all dirty from working at 92. And while we were gone, taking our breaks and getting some food and stuff like that, and the doors were opening, well, the Connect programming broke. It just stopped. So actually, when 92 opened, for the first 20 minutes, the Oregon Project wasn't working. No one really knows that because we were able to cobble together a solution, and we got it working within a half hour. We got it fully functional within a half hour. There's no doubt, particularly it was really hard, I think, on Keith and Anita, because they had flown over here again for a second time to build the Oregon Project, to be part of the build team for that, and all of a sudden it didn't work. I mean, it was stressful and painful.
And Graham came for that too.
And Graham was here as well, of course, yeah. So going back a little bit, so Neil and I went and met with the team in Scotland. We all worked together on developing the concept and the execution of what ultimately would become the Oregon Project in Scotland, in Irvine. And then in the week prior to the opening of 92, the team joined Neil and I, who had already been working at King Street Station for most of the month leading up to the opening of 92. So that team came over. So we were augmented at that point. Tracy Byron came over to help. Anita was hands-on help. Graham was here to help with the physical installation as well as the audio mixing and to compare notes and to refine our audio tracks as we were actually building the Oregon Project at 92. And it was hard. It was hard for everyone involved. We'd never done this before. No one had ever done something like 92 before in this kind of environment.
And then you have Dan, because then you decided to switch it up and take it somewhere else.
Yeah, and then so going from 92 in Seattle and taking this kind of delicate coalition of elements, Keith's art, the speaker arrays, the wiring, the programming, the Microsoft Connects, the various computers that have to run all this stuff and the audio interfaces. We had to get it and sort of port it to Scotland. Luckily, Graham, in the work that he does as an audio engineer, has a lot of equipment himself and access to equipment and also access to people who are really, really great. So we had a great team on the ground in Scotland to walk into, but that didn't necessarily translate into a seamless build because we were taking something that was designed for a large rectangle and putting it into a much smaller room. And we had to make some choices. Some of the technology didn't really sort of work well in the new environment. There were a lot of delays in terms of getting all the pieces to talk to each other. Once we had those problems in Seattle, and we had those problems again in Scotland. And we had a new team that we were working with. Everyone was working very, very hard, but sometimes technology just doesn't cooperate. And so there were some frustrations. There was a lot of waiting around sometimes to get these elements to work. There was a lot of trial and error. Everyone kept their cool, and everyone, I think, ultimately worked well together, but I think it took its toll. Projects like the Oregon project aren't easy. A lot of things have to work right and have to work right consistently before you can trust that you can want to invite people into that experience. And it taxes people intellectually, it taxes people in terms of time, the physical demands of hanging equipment and speakers and stuff like that, and lights. All that's hard. These are hard projects to do. And you're never guaranteed that they're going to work, which makes the sort of psychological toll sometimes really hard on people who are working on these together.
Do you think it took a psychological toll on Keith?
Yes. I think it took a psychological toll on everybody.
So you had said that when you met Keith for the first time at a gallery opening of
Yeah.
his work in Edinburgh. So you go back there this time. I'm wondering, that was some years ago-ish. Has Keith changed as an artist from that point to where you see now when you go back to Edinburgh this last time?
I think so. I mean, I think Keith can talk more eloquently about it, but the opportunity that I had by being a collaborator within the Oregon Project piece allowed me to sort of get to know Keith even on a different level. And I really got an opportunity to hear about how he conceptualizes the work that he does. We all experience artists like Keith either by after they've done the work and the painting is hanging on the wall, or in the case of Keith Salmon, if you take the opportunity to go to his studio in Irvine, you can talk to him and watch him work. And he'll explain to you stuff that's going on, right? But the depth of how much he thinks about his work, whether it's visual or now audio, is really extensive. And it goes to a place that not all of us have the opportunity to know about, how a working artist actually works. And conceptually, Keith is really a deep thinker, conceptually, about art and how art functions and how people experience and what he has to do to get his ideas across in that partnership. And he pre-thinks these things very, very, for long periods of time. He's a very methodical worker. He can work very quickly, but that's because he's done it for years and he's thought through many of the challenges of working with paint on canvas, right? He's done this and he's good at it, and that's why he can work as an artist relatively quickly with paint on canvas or through drawing. But that is muscle memory. That is doing this a lot. And it's why he can be so successful also when he can't see the canvas all that well. And so the opportunity that afforded me to be a collaborator with him as he's extending this practice was amazing. And I did see some growth. Not necessarily as Keith as the artist, but Keith in terms of his reach as an artist. To see his creative process being applied to something that was new and outside of his comfort zone certainly was something that I think was challenging, and I think Keith is growing as an artist in all these ways. It also I got the opportunity to know him better as just sort of a friend, and at various times it was hard for me to watch how difficult this process was for someone who has a lot of control around the work that they do, if it's a canvas and some paint, to really work collaboratively with a number of other people that he had just trust and rely upon. And I don't think that's necessarily something that was second nature to Keith. But I think he grew as an artist, and I think his relationship with Graham in particular grew through that collaboration. Not easy, but I think Keith recognizes that as he continues to develop as an artist and as his sight declines, he's going to have to work collaboratively and develop those trust relationships outside of just him and what he can do more fully.
I know you went back to Glen Rosa with Keith.
Yeah.
On your last trip, and there were some struggles. Keith was struggling.
Yeah.
What was that like for you to watch after going years ago on this pretty much same trip?
Yeah. I really value that first trip to Glen Rosa with Keith and Anita and David for a number of reasons. Not because it became the genesis necessarily of a documentary film that I'm producing and directing, but also as an introduction to the Scottish landscape and to really see it in a way that's really quite beautiful, and to be able to be taken into this corner of Scotland that's not as well known as, as other really sort of iconic places like Glencoe or, the Highlands, Glencoe, some of the outer Hebridean islands, these really sort of iconic landscapes of Scotland. So to really be introduced to this really beautiful, very, particular part of Scotland, I think it's always resonated with me. Even more importantly, though, that first trip is really important to me because it allowed me to get to know Keith better as a human being. And I think we became friends on that trip. We really saw eye to eye about, I think, a lot of things as two artists talking to each other. And that was really, really valuable. And I'll always be glad about that. I didn't really understand the extent of Keith's initial visual impairment, but also the challenges of cataracts on top of that. He and I have talked over the years abstractly about how the cataracts are becoming worse and how they might be, impacting his sight into the future, and why he's making the choices that he is of moving into audio and stuff like that. But I just sort of didn't think about what that experience was like. And we decided to go back to Glen Rosa. It's a place that we all love going to, to do a little bit more shooting, to do a little bit more talking, but also maybe in ways just sort of celebrate the fact that we had done the Oregon project together. We were, seeing the light at the end of the tunnel for the documentary, and then just going out there to sort of be. And the weather was really not great. It was rainy and very overcast. Beautiful in its own way. Got an opportunity to see Glen Rosa sort of, in summertime when it's very green, but it was hard and there was not a lot of light, and Keith really struggled. His vision has gotten to the point where he just can't see that well, and I felt terrible because I wasn't really aware of that. And it was only in Glen Rosa that we came to the point where we understood that Keith actually just at times now can't actually even do hill walking in a way that he once was able to do. And I was shocked by that, and it would surprise me. It upset me to a degree. I wasn't aware of it, and I felt terrible.
You say you felt terrible. Why would you feel terrible?
I felt guilty.
Did you feel responsibility for it?
No, I felt guilty because I felt like I hadn't been paying attention. Not that it's Keith's requirement to update everybody in his world about where his eyesight is, but I felt on some level that, one, I was still to some degree exploiting Keith's visual impairment by making a movie about the visually impaired painter, the blind painter. That's always been a difficult tension within me in making this movie, about respecting him, his boundaries, his process, but also at the same time wanting to show the world, like, here's this great artist, look at what he does. Oh, by the way, he's visually impaired. And then all of a sudden on that last hike into Glen Rosa, the visual impairment became the dominant thing that I was thinking about because I had not been paying attention to it. I had not been really asking him about it. And to a degree, I felt guilty because I was just incurious about it, and he was struggling. And laughing is not going to help.
Stop having fun over there. I'm gonna go over some of the notes here. Oh, well, I didn't know. I don't know what time I wrote this question down. What do you think sets Keith apart from other artists?
I think what makes Keith unique as an artist is that he combines really, I think, solid technique in his painting and drawing skills with a abstraction conceptually about how he renders landscapes that are very unabstract. Keith does work in the Scottish landscape. It's hard granite. It's barren hills. It's skies that, though they do change, they're rigid in what they allow people to see. They're beautiful, right? Keith is able to take those sort of rigid viewpoints, those rigid perspectives that some are very famous and we've all seen, whether we've actually been in Scotland or seen them rendered on film or in photography, right? They're iconic landscapes. And he has an ability to take a very rigid and rigorous painting technique to render those landscapes, but also to make them abstractions, which in a way, I also believe enhances those landscapes and provides a perspective on them that draws even more authenticity to the experience of being in those landscapes. So Keith's strength, I think, is marrying fantastic drawing technique, painting technique, with an emotional relationship to these landscapes that he's able to abstract and reorganize on canvas that makes them beautiful. Shit. That's it. Did we get even close to what we needed to cover?
Yeah, I think actually we did. I think so. I think there's a lot there for her to work with.
Yeah, I was hoping actually just to a description of what the Oregon Project is.
I think you hit on it.
Yeah, no, I mean, I mean, one thing I'm going to have to say at some point, someone's going to say is the Oregon Project is this. You walk into a room, there are speakers overhead, and then depending upon your relationship to 3 panel drawings in front of you, it will trigger sounds to come out. But I can't do that here.
Well, what's your time frame right now?
Oh, that's an hour.
What?
That was an hour.